I'd like to introduce the first panelist, Emilie Mazzacurati. Emilie is the global head of Moody's Climate Solutions, where she oversees the Climate Solutions suite within Moody's ESG Solutions Group. So we're very happy to have you here, Emilie, and the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Lou, and good afternoon, everybody. Good morning to anyone who is on the West Coast like me. It's the beauty of those remote events. You get to cover a lot of time zones all at once. So just quick introduction. Thanks, Lou, for the words about Moody's ESG Solutions. Moody's ESG Solutions is a new group within Moody's, created with the acquisition of 427 and Vigeo Eiris, also known as VE now, and provider of climate, ESG, and sustainable finance analytics and services. The one caveat that I want to mention right away is I do not represent the credit ratings agency side of the house. I have the Moody's name, but not speaking on behalf of the ratings team. So what I'll talk about today in my allotted 10 minutes is some of the trends that I see in the market. Peter asked me to be broad in terms of what I thought were the important developments for ESG and climate data. And I see three main trends that I want to talk about. One is standardization, one is mainstreaming, and the third one is innovation. So I'll talk about how those trends manifest, maybe a little bit what risks they bring and where this is all headed. Starting with standardization, something we have been calling for a long time for those of us who have been working on ESG and climate over the past 15 years. Lou, I hear you, you have been doing that too. The flurry, the thousands of articles that Lou was just describing, have also reached a point where there is a great need for more clarity in the market, more commonalities around how we look and define certain things. What do we measure? How do we calculate? What are the right metrics? How do we provide transparency? So I'll give a couple of examples because we are, from my standpoint, at a turning point in terms of the standardization. There's been a lot of work in the previous years leading to this point, and now we are seeing this standardization take place from some of the most central stakeholders, regulators, and industry groups that are really going to set the rules for how ESG is done going forward. Some of the most meaningful developments that we're seeing, I'll talk a little bit about climate first and then ESG. On climate, we're seeing a ton of regulatory developments. We're seeing those in Europe, in Asia, we're seeing those in Canada, and in the US, certainly there is a loud ping coming from the financial regulatory groups, the Fed, the SEC, the CFTC, FSOC, and all of those groups who had been very, very quiet for the past 4 years and are now very present and sending strong signals that regulation is coming. And so that means regulation around how do we define climate risk, how do we expect banks and investors and insurance to incorporate climate risk into their risk management systems. How do we expect them to disclose what they're doing, what the risks are, what the opportunities are? We're seeing also momentum around some industry initiatives that will help, again, provide transparency and clarity for things. So something like the Partnership for Carbon Accounting Financials, PCAF, where we're seeing banks coming together and saying, all right, let's tackle some of those hard nitty-gritty topics, like how do we measure the carbon footprint from an auto loan, right? From a home loan, retail things that data providers like ourselves may not have covered historically, and where there is demand and a need for banks in this case to be rigorous, transparent, and consistent in how those are measured so that we understand how the different institutions are contributing, for the better or for the worse, to the current situation. One of the most important development, I would say, is the interest from the IFRS in incorporating and creating standards around how climate is accounted for. And of course, we know they will move on to ESG after that. And that brings me to ESG, and we've seen a lot of developments in Europe in particular around the Sustainability Finance Reporting Directive, SFRD, which calls for rigorous data dictionary, right? We are going through each of our ESG metrics and refining and clarifying and making sure that the definitions for each of those metrics aligns with what the regulators expect, with what the market expect, with what the data supports. And so this sort of big spring cleanup work, I think, is really healthy for the market, as long as, and that's the one thing to keep in mind for the standardization bucket, is we don't go too far and freeze in time where we're at right now with ESG and climate data in a way that would stifle innovation. We need to acknowledge that today's knowledge is still limited. There's still a lot of work that's needed ahead, and so there needs to be some flexibility around how these things will evolve over time. Second topic is mainstreaming, and that manifests in a couple of different ways. One is mainstreaming of ESG across ESG, if I can describe it this way. In the past, it may have been perceived as a collection of disparate topics. If you think about climate and health and social matters, and I think what we've seen over the past couple of years, and this past year in particular, is how closely interconnected all those topics are. You cannot talk about climate change without talking about racial equity. You cannot talk about COVID without talking about racial equity. You can't talk about gender without talking about economic performance, governance, and salary gaps, and performance goals for ESG and climate. So all of those topics really come together, and increasingly they are being addressed together. And that's a very positive development from my standpoint. We're also seeing mainstreaming in the economy. So we're going from a world where ESG was perceived as non-financial to a world where it is recognized as financial, and that there is, in fact, dual materiality, financial and non-financial. And the signal for me that's really telling is the renaming of the European directive from the non-financial reporting directive to the corporate sustainability reporting directive. It's a small thing, but it was really grating me personally, and I think it's symbolically really important. What we're seeing from the SEC about disclosures, of course, really is a great example of mainstreaming, right? The fact that we have some of the largest corporations in the US from the corporate roundtable stating that the purpose of a corporation is not just maximizing shareholder value, but also being a contributor, a positive contributor to society. Those are all developments that show that ESG is increasingly recognized as being part of business activities, economic activities, and certainly, again, regulations and market expectations. And then the third piece of the mainstreaming is the mainstreaming into risk management and financial decision. And I'll speak more about climate because I think climate is most advanced from that standpoint, where we're seeing expectations that banks will incorporate climate considerations into all their risk management process, into credit origination, into stress testing, into capital requirements over time, that it will be incorporated into financial instruments. That's a really big deal. Again, that means that all of a sudden we're going from, on the one hand, ESG climate, on the other, real business, to this is all one and in one place. And that's how we're going to get ESG and climate to really, and ESG and climate data to really have the impact that it needs to have and should have over the broader market. Third and last trend that I'm seeing is innovation. And I see two kinds of innovation. One is around the growing role of alternative data. So thinking about what kind of data and what kind of technology can be used to create ESG and climate data to better understand the exposure or the risk or the contribution from different corporations or financial institutions. You can think about AI being used to scrape really large data sets over the internet, to be used to interpret geospatial imagery. You can think of remote sensing. For example, we're working right now to use remote sensing imagery to monitor deforestation almost in real time, right, on a couple of weeks basis, to monitor pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. There's a lot of interesting work. There's a lot that can be done down the road with IoT, the Internet of Things, and remote sensors, again, sending data in real time. And so embedding this data set and the signals that they send in a way that's meaningful into financial models, into risk management processes will be very impactful. The other piece is financial innovation. We've seen growth over the past years of social bonds. We've seen some first resilience bonds being issued by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, by the state of California. So a lot of institutions trying to push the boundaries of what we can do to support amending the problems, to support impact around ESG and climate data. And we're also seeing, again, technology really feeding into how some of this financial innovation is taking place. And I would say the risk here, the thing to keep in mind is not falling in the trap of thinking that some magical technology development will fix it all for us and will fix all our mess, especially when it comes to climate and biodiversity. We need to aim for technology solutions, but we can't assume and defer action while waiting for some technology silver bullet. And that takes me to my concluding thoughts here around maybe what should be a fourth trend, and that's ambition, right? The stakes are high. It's important to celebrate how far we've come over the past 10 years, going from a fringe trend in a way to something that is truly becoming mainstream and standardized. But also we need to acknowledge that we're not moving remotely fast enough when it comes to addressing the climate crisis, the biodiversity crisis, the water stress crisis. It is an existential threat, right? The physical impacts of climate change, combined with broader environmental pressure, unsustainable natural resource consumption, water scarcity, biodiversity loss, and the ripple effects, impact on migration in particular, are really critical. And we've seen a spate of recent commitments around net zero carbon and really cutting greenhouse gas emissions coming from both governments and corporates, which is very encouraging, but also has been met and should be met with some healthy skepticism. How are we going to do this? Are we ready for the changes that are required? And just last week during the Biden Climate Summit, Secretary Granholm referred to our generation's moonshot project, right? Solving climate change is really the biggest challenge ahead of us, and we have to find a way. The ambition needs to be supported by everything that I mentioned before, by rigorous standards, systematic mainstreaming, technological and financial innovation. And this is where ESG and climate data can really help be the measuring stick that shows progress and nudges for more progress where it's needed, so that it can support the social and technical transformation that will allow it to survive and thrive. Lou, I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Wow, that was great. Thank you, Emilie. That was really a great opening to set the stage for the day, for the conversations. I really enjoyed it. And I agree with everything that you said. Two things that stuck out to me, or that I would question, throw a question out on. And by the way, any of the attendees who would like to ask questions, please send them through the Q&A function. You mentioned double materiality for a moment, during the standards part of your discussion. And then you also mentioned, I think these are somewhat connected in my mind, the BRT focus on stakeholder inclusiveness, sort of moving away from shareholder primacy in a way towards a more inclusive, purpose-driven company. But in some ways, when you piece it all together, I think, having stakeholders that are treated well, respected, their inputs are taken into account, their well-being is taken into account, leads to better interactions between those stakeholders and your company, buying more, working harder, better brand recognition, all these kind of things that ultimately lead to financial impact as well. But I wanted to ask, could you elaborate on this concept of double materiality? Because I think it's a little bit important, and it's kind of new, at least as a term. The concept has been around, but this term is getting a lot more attention now. Could you tell us a little bit more about what double materiality is?
Sure, and maybe I'll start by taking a step back and saying, for many years, when corporations were asked questions about social welfare and environmental impacts and other ESG related aspects, the answer was, oh, but we need to focus on shareholders, on maximizing shareholder and on profitability, and this isn't what corporations are about, right? And the first, that's not always been like that. Historically, that focus on maximizing shareholder is something more recent of the past decades. It was not necessarily how a corporation was thought about back 100 years ago. And I think the fact that some very large corporations in the US, members of the BRT, I believe there's over 100, that includes Moody's and many others, are trying to shift the conversation and saying, no, guys, come on, let's be realistic here, right? We can't just be focused on financial revenues. We know it doesn't work. Is a really significant development because it opens, breathing room, and it opens space for that conversation over all the different ways that corporations impact societies through their employees, their suppliers, through their activities, and potential environmental externalities. I think there's a lot of work ahead for the two materiality component to be on the same footing. We're far from there, right? And the other materiality, the sustainability, the ESG materiality, is how impactful is the firm on certain shareholders, stakeholders, so not shareholders, stakeholders, groups around them that do not benefit necessarily directly or indirectly from how well the company is doing financially, but are very affected one way or another by what the company is doing. And so the dual materiality is really to encourage or require companies to look at both and manage both. The reality, I think, is that even in the best intended companies, it's still not on the same footing, and the CEO will wake up in sweat about changes to the action, to the share price, in a way that maybe not every stakeholder issue will raise to their attention. But there is at least the opportunity to have that conversation and to work towards a better accountability towards stakeholders more broadly.
Thank you for that great answer. One more, I guess, thing that I think might be good to touch on a little bit more is, the bringing together of the different standards, organizations, or, the efforts to create sort of a global sustainability standard by certain groups, and there are a couple of them out there now that have kind of gotten going really quick. They've really just accelerated at the same time. I guess it's, IFRS, the EU regulations, even the SEC now, kind of hinting around it, and the group of five, right, which I've called it the GRI and SASB and TCFD and a few other, CDP, I think, and there's one other, but that group of five also all looking to do basically a similar thing, which is to remove all the confusion around sort of which standard should we use, which is the best one for our purposes, or and ultimately which are going to be referenced by regulation in some way, or which is going to be this global standard. What are your thoughts on what's happening out there right now? Do you have anything you can add for the audience, sort of, on what you see in that area, or challenges or opportunities, or anything that you have in mind, in your experience around this effort currently underway?
Sure. I mean, first I'll start by saying I think it's a very positive development, and that cannot be understated. The courage, in a way, that it requires from those different standards to say, yes, we're going to work together to align our requirements and our metrics is again not to be understated, because it could be tempting for some of those organizations to prioritize institutional survival. Like, we need to continue to exist because we have something very differentiated that we bring to the world, as opposed to the discussion what's happening now, which is we all have a common mission, a common purpose, and we will all achieve that mission faster if we work together, even if that means that in the long run, there might not be all 5 standards on the market. And there's been a lot of quiet alignment behind the scenes between those organizations for a while now, especially around climate, with the drive from the TCFD, the Taskforce for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But it can be hard for organizations that also needs to justify how they do something very differentiated to get funding, right? And so there's some dynamics around there that can really work around collaboration. And what we're seeing now with that collaboration is really important. And I think all those groups work together, right? There's a couple of different initiatives, but those people talk to each other. And so I think we will get to alignment in the end. I am an optimist from that standpoint. I think we will be able to really extract the best of all the work that's been done for the past 10 years and bring it together in one place.
Great. I hope so too. I think we're heading in that direction. I also
Fingers crossed.
very positive. Yeah, very positive. But it has, as you point out, been going on behind the scenes for quite some time. So hopefully it's coming to a head now. And you know, there's other powerful forces and bodies that are moving in this direction, which hopefully could take it over the finish line in the near future. So there's 2 quick questions that did come in from the Q&A that I'm going to ask at once because I think they're quick responses, and I think it's we're getting towards the end of our 20 minutes. So one is define the difference. Can you please define the difference between shareholder and stakeholder? And the second is, how is the dual materiality different from the triple bottom line? So I think those should be.
Okay. So first question, shareholders are the ones who hold shares of the company. So they're the investors in the company. Stakeholders is anybody else who is affected somehow by the company. It could be employees, suppliers, it could be communities where a factory or plant is happening. It could be all of us when it comes to a large carbon emitters. So stakeholders is much more fluid as a concept. It includes shareholders by definition, but it's much broader. And that's something that companies spend quite a bit of time on, is figuring out which stakeholders they want to account for when they think about their broader impact. And then the next question, I'm afraid I'm going to step on toes. There might be very differentiated view, but to me, they're all around the same concept between triple bottom line and dual materiality. This is about aligning the financial and economic goals of a company together with its broader impact on economic, social, and governance at large.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Emilie, for the time. Do you have any closing thoughts or?
But I just look forward to the rest of the event and the next panelist. Thank you so much for having me.
All right, me too, Emilie. Thank you.